So I'm so happy to be here today and to talk to you about Homer and my love for Homer. A professor of literature who I really admire, Lewis Cohen, says of his works that they are prized for their beauty of conception, their verbal subtlety and consistency, their soaring imaginative power, and the drama of their depiction of human experience. She says that for Homer, the definitive condition of life is not peace, but battle. And that notion of the definitive condition of life as battle is what Herman Melville, centuries later, will call the sense of the tragic. And he argued that modern man desperately needs to maintain a sense of the tragic, which is Greek in origin, to save his life from, as Lewis Mumford writes, shriveling into small prudences, petty gains and routine, or that calcified apathy and aimlessness which disillusioned postmodern writers like Kafka or Albert Camus portray. So, what does Homer, who wrote 2,700 years ago, at least, today, who is pagan, have to say to Christians of the modern era? This is my question, and I'm always asking myself again and again as I prepare to teach ninth grade. And to approach just one aspect of it today, I'd like to begin with a poem. It's a poem by the English romantic William Wordsworth. It's his "The World is Too Much with Us." If you have a ninth grader, she probably memorized it. So maybe it's familiar. The world is too much with us. Late and soon, getting and spending, we lay waste our powers. Little we see in nature that is ours. We have given our hearts away, a sordid boon. This sea that bears her bosom to the moon, the winds that will be howling at all hours, and are upgathered now like sleeping flowers. For this, for everything, we are out of tune. It moves us not. Great God, I'd rather be a pagan, suckled in a creed outworn. So might I, standing on this pleasant lea, have glimpses that would make me less forlorn, have sight of Proteus rising from the sea, or hear old Triton blow his wreathed horn. Wordsworth composed this sonnet in 1802 during the Industrial Revolution, in reaction to the Industrial Revolution, and its effect on man's desires and his relationship to nature. So it's his critique of modernity. We lay waste our powers, he says, meaning we waste the power of our hearts on consumption. In return, he says, we have a sordid boon, which is another way of saying a squalid prize. We can no longer see, hear, or even value the world of nature, its beauty, its majesty. For this, for everything, we are out of tune, it moves us not. So modern man's boon, his sordid boon, is a heart of stone, a heart that can't be moved. But then the sonnet turns, as sonnets do, and he makes his really interesting exclamation, declaring he'd rather be a pagan in a creed outworn. So he might have sight of Proteus rising from the sea, or hear old Triton blow his wreathed horn. This line always makes me pause. So he's saying he'd rather be nursed, fed, kept alive on an old, outworn pagan creed than feed off the creed of modern man. If only he could see life within nature. If he could see images, personas, to bolster his heart, Greek mythology, that creed outworn animates the inanimate. So the Greeks were dissatisfied with lifeless nature. They gave it a face. To the Greek, the creation is far more than mere matter. So truer in the poetic sense is the Greek's creed than the Enlightenment or the rationalist reduction of everything to the simplest material. Wordsworth writes about the worth of the Greeks' vision and their imagination. in contrast to modern man's tendency to reduce. So I'd like to follow his vein. He sets me up well. But talk about Homer's depiction of the Greeks' heart, their ability to feel. In particular, their ability to feel grief as a powerful depiction of love and an anticipation of Christian revelation. I am going to just focus on the Iliad. I thought I would do both epics, but it was too much. Stick with this. So to do so, I'll walk you through the text of the Iliad, pausing at some poignant moments to reflect on his portrayal of grief, and we can gather whatever wisdom there is. So in case you haven't read the text in a while, I'll begin at the beginning with some context. Homer opens the poem saying, "Sing, goddess, the anger of Peleus' son Achilles, and its devastation, which put pains upon the Achaeans." So he begins his epic by invoking the muse, which is another way of saying the goddess of art, or the goddess of eloquence, the goddess of truth, to help him tell the story of Achilles' wrath and its devastating consequences. So he tells us in the opening lines of the poem that I didn't bring it, it's really thick. The entire poem, the subject of it is passion, it's wrath, and its consequences. Okay, so in the beginning, the action is not on the battlefield, but the Trojan War, that really, really long, eventful war fought over Helen, has been ongoing for years. Lewis Cohen writes, "In their long siege of Troy, the Greeks, who set out to punish a crime against the inviolability of marriage, forget the pieties of home. They themselves are gradually transformed into becoming violators." So through Homer's art, we encounter paradox. The Greeks are avenging Menelaus, whose wife was stolen. In doing so, they shatter the domestic lives of many of the Trojans. The Trojans are fighting in defense of their homeland, despite Paris's ineptitude as a man. And they follow Hector, Paris' brother, an upright man. And so the story begins not on a battlefield, but at a camp, with Achilles, the hero of the poem, picking a fight with Agamemnon, the lord of men, the leader of the Greeks. Achilles insults him repeatedly, always making the girls laugh. I copied a few of his insults, they're pretty funny. He says, "Oh, wrapped in shamelessness, with your mind forever on profit, how shall any one of the Achaeans readily obey you, either to go on a journey or to fight men strongly in battle?" And then a little bit later on, he says, "You wine sack, with a dog's eyes and a deer's heart. Never once have you taken courage in your heart to arm your people for battle, or to go and fight with the best of the Achaeans." So essentially, Achilles is completely irate with Agamemnon. He's fed up with his pride, his rank. He's fed up fighting for him, he's fed up having left his own land for the sake of one household. And his people's households are being ruined in the process. And so he leaves the war to sit and stay on the sidelines, which is devastating to the Greeks, because his prowess in battle is divine. So in anguish and wrath, he predicts to Agamemnon before the entire assembly that one day he will regret not giving Achilles his proper due. He calls out, "And then you will eat out the heart within you in sorrow, that you did no honor to the best of the Achaeans." And then he goes one step further in his wrath, always shocking the girls. He prays to Zeus that Zeus will turn the tide of the war to aid the Trojans, their enemies. So he prays that his best friends will lose. So that Agamemnon in particular will feel the weight of his loss. They'll feel how much they miss him. At this point, in the beginning, the energy of Achilles' heart, his entire passion is spent on his thirst for honor, for glory, and it's often shocking to the Christian notion of humility, but his desperate desire for glory hinges upon his thirst for immortality. For Achilles, life eternal, life after death, can only be had through glory won on earth. And so his resentment of Agamemnon is magnified. For him, the consequences are eternal. So although recklessly sought and self-centered, his thirst for life at the outset is arrestingly grand, and it consumes him totally. He is not apathetic. Zeus answers Achilles' prayer. So moving on. And the Trojans, led by Hector, devastate the Greeks. They suffered grand losses. There are pages upon pages of violent depictions of said losses. Until finally the great and mighty Agamemnon sees his folly. Homer writes that the son of Atreus was stricken at heart with the great sorrow, and that Agamemnon stood before them being the men in the council, shedding tears like a spring dark running, that down the face of a rock impassable drips with water. So notice that this fierce warrior, the Lord of Men, called leader of men by Homer repeatedly, weeps in front of his fellow soldiers. He feels their losses so acutely, and he doesn't consider expressing his feeling as a sign of weakness. Finally, he converts, turns his heart, admits and rejects his former attitude towards Achilles as madness, and sends an embassy to Achilles to beg his return. He promises him amazing wealth, homes, cities, treasures, even sonship through marriage if he'll return and save the Greeks. So he sends a man of war, a great fighter, Ajax. He sends the clever, the intellectual Odysseus, and someone beloved, his mentor and tutor who raised him, Phoenix. Each makes a stirring speech, appealing to Achilles' reason, his emotion, his loyalty, even weeping tears. But at this point, Achilles won't be moved. He won't join the fight. Most girls at this stage of the reading hold him in contempt, favoring Hector, the wonderful father and husband to Andromache, and wondering aloud why he is the hero of the epic. Because to their petitions, Achilles is stone, like a stone. He says in response, "Fate is the same for the man who holds back, the same if he fights hard. We are all held in a single honor, the brave with the weaklings. A man dies still if he has done nothing, as one who has done much. Nothing is won for me, now that my heart has gone through its afflictions and forever setting my life on the hazard of battle." In other words, why do I try for greatness? Why fight? Why live? I'm going to die anyway, so I might at least choose a comfortable path beforehand. So now at this point, his reasons for leaving the war have shifted away from wrath against Agamemnon, and they've begun to move towards a philosophical wrath and angst, if you will. He's angry about the futility of war itself, even excellence in battle. His objection then is now cosmic. He is frustrated and angry at the order of things in the cosmos, valuing his life and life in general above all else. He says, "For not worth the value of my life are all the possessions they fable were won for Ilion, and a man's life cannot come back again. It cannot be lifted nor captured again by force once it has crossed the teeth's barrier." Cohen again says, "He rejects the gifts of Agamemnon and the conventional honor they represent precisely because such things mean nothing to a dead man." So the Iliad piercingly raises the question of what it means to be human and to have to die. Homer elicits the deep intuition that death is a terrible deprivation and a metaphysical wrong, not a natural part of life. In this respect, the poem agrees with the biblical revelation that death is abnormal and incongruous, following only from sin committed by our original parents. And so he won't fight, and in a sense he won't live. He refuses to enter the stage of battle, if you will. So I take time to establish this context and his obstinacy, because without it, his return to battle doesn't really matter. It's not as powerful. So the epic turns, and it hinges upon friendship. The friendship of his best friend, Patroclus, who begs first for Achilles to fight on behalf of the Greeks. And when he says no again, he begs that he might, in Achilles' armor then, fight on behalf of the Greeks, so that they, seeing his resplendent armor, might think Achilles is with them and then feel encouraged. Achilles agrees. So with Achilles' permission and support, and clothed in his own armor, a sign of terror to his enemies, Patroclus, given the epithet by Homer, great-hearted, fights in Achilles' stead. And he fights out of compassion and brotherly love for his fellows. Warned to stay close to the ships, Patroclus is heedless of Achilles' advice and his directive because he fights too passionately. And so he takes on the Trojans and their stronghold Hector to his demise. Describing Patroclus' death, Homer writes, "He fell thunderously to the horror of all the Achaean people. He spoke, and as he spoke, the end of death closed in upon him, and the soul, fluttering free of his limbs, went down into death's house, mourning her destiny, leaving youth and manhood behind her. Like a storm then he falls, embarking towards grim death's house, no heaven, no hell, just gray, shadowed nothingness, leaving behind manhood and youth, the prize of the Greeks." So it is, of course, the death of his best friend, his brother in arms, and fellow sojourner that finally moves Achilles' heart outside of itself, bringing him back in touch with life. It is his wrenching, deeply felt grief and his desire for justice and a remedy that awakens the hero. So the following grips me every time I read it. It gives me chills. It's Homer's depiction of Achilles receiving the news of his best friend's death. The messenger, as he spoke, it is said that a black cloud of sorrow closed on Achilles. In both hands he caught up the grimy dust and poured it over his head and face, and fouled his handsome countenance. And the black ashes were scattered over his immortal tunic. And he himself, mightily in his might, lay in the dust at length, and took and tore at his hair with his hands and defiled it. Homer refers to dust countless times throughout the epic, and the dust, of course, symbolizes death. That the living and breathing beings we love are not but dust is chilling to the core, and for Greeks who have no resolution, post-death, it's horrifying. So here, the great godlike Achilles covers himself in the dust of the earth, willingly defiling his immortal tunic, willingly encountering death because of his love of Patroclus. So his grief brings him to the ground. And next, Homer describes Antilochus, the messenger, who moves toward Achilles to grieve with him. He stands next to him, letting tears fall, and holds Achilles' hands. These are two great warriors, but in their grief, they stand next to each other, looking each other in the eyes, crying, holding hands. And then Achilles is said to have cried out terribly, aloud. And the lady, his mother, heard him as she sat in the depths of the sea, and she cried shrill in turn. And the goddesses gathered about her, all who along the depths of the sea were the daughters of Nereus. So finally, he utters this shrill lament. It's a terrifying cry. And it's so loud that it reaches the depths of the sea, which is where his half-divine mother lives. And she, when she hears it, responds in kind, and so do all of her attendants. So here, his grief over one man, one dear friend, travels far, invites compassion, and spreads, making it representative of a grief beyond that for Patroclus and that for man in general. So in the end, he doesn't return to battle for himself, for his own thirst for glory, for the Greek standard of honor or excellence, nor does he return for worldly gain, but instead out of grief for the loss of just one best friend, and in some desperate attempt to establish justice, to renew the disorder that Patroclus' death leaves behind him in his wake. So only great lovers grieve like Achilles. Even Achilles' subsequent description on battle, which is really brutal and reckless, is but a personification of that love, of that rage within the heart of someone at the loss of their beloved. For example, his mother, like all mothers do, asks him, "Why are you so upset? You have what you desired, you got what you prayed for. Zeus granted it." And sighing heavily, he answers, "My mother, all these things the Olympian brought to accomplishment, but what pleasure is this to me, since my dear companion has perished, Patroclus, whom I loved beyond all other companions, as well as my own life. I have lost him." So for Achilles, then, love of his friend is worth more to him than his own life or his frustration with mortality. And right away, he sets out knowing he must die, saying, "I must die soon then, since I was not to stand by my companion when he was killed." So I'll pause there. That marks the switch in Achilles' life. So now I'm going to switch sides briefly. Homer himself does this all the time in the epic. You're with the Greeks, and then you're with the Trojans. He takes you into the palace of King Priam, king of Troy, for example, and into the heart of his best son, Hector, and he forces your discomfiture. He increases the tension of the poem, because if the Greeks win, Hector must die. And the lovely Andromache and his wife will be a widow, and their infant son left an orphan. But then if the Trojans win, that gentle, kind, and good Patroclus will have died for naught, and Achilles' strength and power will be left unfulfilled. And so accordingly, in that tension, Homer captures the devastating nature of war. At its heart is passion, it's wrath. Achilles names it so himself. He says, "I wish that strife would vanish away from gods and mortals, and gall, which makes man grow angry for all his great mind, that gall of anger that swarms like smoke inside of a man's heart and becomes a thing sweeter to him by far than the dripping of honey." So to Achilles, it is passion, wrath, and discord, deeply embedded and beloved within the heart of man, sweeter to him than honey even, that causes war. To the next moment of the epic, I'd like to bring you, it involves King Priam. So King Priam, king of Troy, father of Hector, the noble and just, looks out from his castle behind the walls and sees Achilles rejoining the battle from a distance. So like a great flare or a dancing star, Achilles' emergence announces itself from far off. He's described as glowing and radiant. And when Priam sees this, Homer writes that he groaned aloud with both hands high uplifted. He knows that Achilles' return means certain death for his son Hector. He moans aloud, saying, "I wish he were as beloved of the immortal as loved by me," he being Hector. "I wish Hector were as beloved of the immortal as loved by me. Soon he will lie dead, and the dogs and the vultures would eat him, and bitter sorrow to be taken from my heart." So here he expresses his longing that his son were worth more to the gods in heaven than he is to himself. So he's experiencing this metaphysical loneliness and grief the grief of the pagan, for whom the cosmology is peopled with gods made in man's image, fickle, imperfect, and partial. They don't love his son more than he does. He's the only one. So his cry is arresting to the Christian, I think, who knows that his plea is satisfied in Christ, but perhaps has become familiar and used to the idea of a benevolent, providential God called Abba, and then, of course, the incarnation in Christ. But for Priam, here he's longing in alienation that someone might care in the heavens that his son will fall. So Priam's longing then is representative of humanity's longing for that, and it gives me chills. Okay, so Hector dies. It happens. In reaction to Hector's death, all of Troy, the entire city, is taken up in wailing and lamentation, as if all of Ilion, the other word for Troy, had been burning top to bottom in fire. That's what Homer says. And then deep within Priam's household, this is what's happening. This is how the grief is expressed. There she, meaning Hermes, found outcry and mourning. The sons sitting around their father inside the courtyard made their clothes sodden with tears, so they're drenched in wet clothing wet by their tears. And among them, the old man sat veiled and beaten behind his mantle. Dung lay thick on the head and neck of the aged man, for he had been rolling in it. So he's been rolling in manure. Yeah, you should have. Yeah, he had gathered and smeared it on with his own hands. And his daughters all up and down the house, and the wives of his sons were mourning as they remembered all those men in their numbers and valor who lay dead. Their lives perished at the hands of the Argives. So here, once again, another depiction of grief. Homer describes it as communal, right? It's shared. It's utterly physical. Public, long-lasting, and like death itself, it's ugly, it's smelly, it's crude. And all of it corresponds to the depth of feeling they possess for life, the life of their brother, their son, or their spouse. Which moves me to my final point. Not only does Homer depict grief for particular people like Patroclus and Hector so poignantly, but he also depicts its frustration, its lack of resolution within the Greek cosmos. For example, Achilles succeeds. He kills the slayer of Patroclus. And so if the heart could be satisfied by an eye for an eye mode of justice, the poem would end in triumph here. But instead, after the sacking of Troy, the Achaeans are feasting and celebrating, and then they go to bed. But Achilles alone stays up all night. Homer writes, "And the games broke up, and the people scattered to go away, each man to his fast-running ship. And the rest of them took thought to their dinner, and of sweet sleep and enjoyment. Only Achilles wept still, as he remembered his beloved companion. Nor did sleep, who subdues all, come over him. But he tossed from one side to the other in longing for Patroclus, for his manhood and his great strength, and all the actions he had seen to the end with him, and the hardships he had suffered, the wars of men, hard crossings of the big waters. Remembering all these things, he let fall the swelling tears, lying sometimes along his side, sometimes along his back, and now again prone on his face. Then he would stand upright and pace, turning in distraction along the beach of the sea. Nor did dawn rising escape him, as she brightened across the sea and the beaches. Then, when he had yoked running horses under the chariot, he would fasten Hector behind the chariot so as to drag him and draw him 3 times around the tomb of Meniotis' fallen son. Then rest again in his shelter and throw down the dead man and leave him to lie sprawled on his face in the dust. So he cannot sleep, he cannot find solace, he cannot find comfort He has been a smashing, glorious success in battle. He satisfied his revenge, but he's still dissatisfied. Moreover, hurting Hector's body is doing nothing. It isn't resolving the problem, and yet he goes in circles and circles and circles, representative of the philosophy, the circular nature of it. He has no resolution. Making the tragedy then less about the particular deaths of the epic and more about death in general. His frustration, his dissatisfaction is that men must die, and he can't do anything about it. This brings us to the concluding and arresting image of the poem. King of Troy, Priam, supplicates, falls to his knees before Achilles, and kisses the hands of Achilles, the very hands that murdered his sons, begging for him to return Hector's body, just so that his family can honor the body. He beseeches him to think of his own father, and then finally, once again, Achilles' heart turns again, more completely, this time laying aside his wrath against death and joining his enemy in grief. So the grief is now joining the two enemies in communion, the shared grief. Homer writes, "So he spoke and stirred in the other a passion of grieving for his own father. He took the old man's hands and pushed him gently away. And the two remembered, as Priam sat, huddled at the feet of Achilles, and wept close for the man slaughtering Hector. And Achilles wept now for his own father, now for Patroclus. The sound of their mourning moved in the house." So the representatives of the Trojans and the representatives of the Greeks are now sitting, huddled, crying face to face, and their sobbing is echoing all throughout the house. So here, war boundaries exist no more, the divide is over, and the two are joined in communion, a shared grief over the loss of the good. It's this cathartic moment that resolves the tension of the epic. Cohen writes, "Achilles, longing for immortality, terrible as its consequences are for his friends Troy and himself, and Priam's devastating grief powerfully engages the fiery spiritual hunger within all human beings." So to grieve that deeply and to long for life that acutely, one has to be great-hearted, able to feel things deeply. And so the cathartic moment then is that shared communion and the release of a shared frustration about immortality. And it is only the great-hearted who can love. So I'll skip centuries and just share this from C.S. Lewis because it's beautiful. In his book, For Loves, he says, "To love at all is to be vulnerable. Love anything and your heart will certainly be wrung and possibly be broken. If you want to make sure of keeping it intact, you must give your heart to no one, not even an animal. Wrap it carefully round with hobbies and little luxuries. Avoid all entanglements. Lock it up safe in the casket or coffin of your own selfishness. But in that casket, safe, dark, motionless, airless, it will change. It will not be broken. It will become unbreakable, impenetrable, irredeemable. The alternative to tragedy, or at least to the risk of tragedy, is damnation. The only place outside heaven where you can be perfectly safe from all the dangers and perturbations of love is hell." Yeah. And so I really appreciate the pagan's depiction of the sting of death and its anticipation and longing for the resurrection. And here, Lewis makes a stance for living on a grand scale like the Greeks, with hearts open and able to feel all the emotions. And so when I read Homer, like Wordsworth, I'm so impressed by their desire for life and immortality that I would echo his notion of imitating their creed outworn to the extent that they're fully alive. I didn't have time to write an entire other paper about the Odyssey, but I do want to leave one thought. I tried to give you one thought about it. So if you think of the Iliad as a poem that cries out against death, you could think of the Odyssey then as a poem that cries out for something. So the Iliad cries out against death, the Odyssey cries out for home. It describes this beautiful longing, deeply embedded within the heart of man for home. And for the Christian, the heart itself is remade, made living and flesh and alive in a proper or fitting place for Christ, making the heart a new kind of home, if you will. I want to just end with a thought from Cardinal Ratzinger about nostalgia. And nostalgia is that interesting, intense feeling and desire for home that I think is universal. He says, nostalgia and longing impel man to pursue the quest. Beauty prevents him from being content with just daily life. It causes him to suffer. In a Platonic sense, we could say that the arrow of nostalgia pierces man, wounds him, and in this way gives him wings, lifts him upwards towards the transcendence. So when you take both poems together, you're left with the notion that we were not made to die, and that we ought to feel as much as the Greeks feel in response to death. And then with the other poem, we're left with the notion that we were made for home, that longing for nostalgia is good and true, and it anticipates Christian revelation. I'll stop there. Thank you so much for your time and for listening to me.